As we gradually come out of the pandemic, the world is turning its attention towards the economic fallout caused by the crisis. As economies across the globe recover from the pandemic, communities that were once cautious and reserved are now beginning to re-establish their pre-pandemic norms, venturing out more frequently and purchasing more goods and services. However, this sudden surge in demand has outpaced the ability of businesses to supply products, resulting in a significant increase in aggregate demand, and in other words, the economies are speeding up, leading to many countries experiencing an inflationary gap. The United States inflation rate as of June 2022 was sitting around 9.1%. Years prior, the average United States inflation rate was 3.8%, a casual 5.3% increase in just about 2 years. I'm just joking. This is definitely not casual. The Federal Reserve and policymakers indicate that an inflation rate of around 2% is acceptable, so it's clear that the United States has a big problem on their hands. It's obvious that the United States are dealing with an inflationary gap, which is characterized by an economy operating at a level of output above its long-term potential. Because of this inflationary gap, this has led to an increase in inflationary pressures, which can have negative consequences for overall economic stability and growth. As of February 2023, the United States inflation rate sits around 6%. What can the United States do to slow down the economy, decrease price levels, and fix this inflationary gap? In order to close this inflationary gap, the United States should implement a combination of fiscal and monetary policies that focus on decreasing aggregate demand and stabilizing prices. The first step in addressing the inflationary gap is to implement contractionary fiscal policies such as changes in taxation and government spending. By increasing taxes, the government can reduce disposable income, leading to lower consumption and reduced aggregate demand. This can help cool down an overheating economy and reduce inflationary pressures. One potential policy change could be to raise the income tax rate for higher income earners, as they are more likely to have a higher marginal propensity to save, thus reducing the impact of overall consumption. Consumption makes a significant impact on the United States GDP. In 2021, it accounted for 67.9% of the total GDP in the US. The US has a progressive tax system, meaning that tax increases when income increases. The average American has an income of around $97,962. which would indicate around 18% tax, meaning that the government takes $17,633, and disposable income would be around $80,000. If the tax percentage increased to say 20%, this would discourage spending even more. Since your disposable income is low, spending would be discouraged, slowing down consumption spending, slowing down the GDP, and hence slowing down the economy and closing the inflationary gap. The government should consider reducing its spending, particularly in areas that contribute to increased demand in short term. This may include scaling back on infrastructure projects such as roads and bridges, which can lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, which can help close the inflationary gap. And we know this works because during the 1980s, the Reagan administration implemented a combination of tax cuts and increased defense spending, which contributed to an increase in aggregate demand and inflation. To counteract this, the Federal Reserve increased the interest rates and the government increased taxes and cut down on spending to decrease deflation and to close the gap. In addition to fiscal policies, the United States should also implement monetary policies to address the inflationary gap. These policies are primarily implemented by the Federal Reserve and include changes to the reserve requirement ratio, the discount rate, and the open market operation. So the reserve requirement ratio refers to a percentage of deposits that the banks must hold as reserves. By increasing the RRR, the Federal Reserve can reduce the amount of money that banks have available to lend, leading to a contraction in the money supply. This in turn can help reduce inflationary pressures by decreasing the amount of credit available in the economy. However, as of April 2023, the reserve requirement ratio of banks in the United States is actually 0%. The banks aren't required to hold any reserves against most deposits. Instead, the Federal Reserve has implemented a policy of paying interest on excess reserves, which provides banks with an incentive to hold reserves voluntarily. So either the Federal Reserve could increase RRR from 0% to something higher, or the Federal Reserve can implement even higher interest rates on excess reserves, making banks openly deposit their reserves with the Federal Reserve, earning them interest, leading to a contraction in the money supply. In the 1970s, the United States experienced a period of high inflation due to an increase in oil prices and the Vietnam War. In order to slow down the economy, the Federal Reserve increased the RRR for banks, reducing the amount of money in circulation, slowing down the economy, and reducing inflationary pressures. The discount rate is the interest rate charged by Federal Reserve to banks for borrowing funds. By raising the discount rate, the Federal Reserve can make it more expensive for banks to borrow money, leading to a reduction in the money supply and decreasing in aggregate demand. The United States discount rate is 2.25%. Increasing that percentage would decrease banks' willingness to borrow money, and this can help close the inflationary gap by reducing credit available and cooling down an overheating economy. However, this policy can also have unintended consequences, such as potentially exacerbating credit crunches and negatively impacting the economy. The open market operations involve the buying and selling of government bonds or securities by the Federal Reserve. To address the inflationary gap, the Federal Reserve should engage in contractionary open market operations by selling government securities. Selling securities will lead to a decrease in the money supply, as banks will have fewer reserves and less money to lend out. As a result, interest rates will increase, leading to a reduction in credit availability and a decrease in aggregate demand. This policy can be effective in closing the inflationary gap, but also have negative implications for interest-sensitive industries and overall economic growth. Increasing the federal funds rate can also slow down the economy. By increasing the federal funds rate, the Federal Reserve can make borrowing more expensive for individuals or businesses, which will reduce the amount of spending and investment in the economy. For example, if the United States raised their federal funds from 2% to 3%, banks may raise the interest rates they charge on loans to consumers and businesses. Since the interest rates are higher, they will borrow less. The act of raising federal funds, which then raises interest rates, delays decisions or cancels spending and investments, slowing down the economy. Wage and price guidelines are policies to fight inflation. These guidelines were essentially voluntary agreements between the government and the business to limit the amount of wages and price could increase. The idea behind this policy is that by limiting the amount that businesses could increase wage and prices, the government could then reduce inflationary pressures, closing the inflationary gap and helping stabilizing the economy. When wages and price are limited, people and businesses have less money to spend, which can lead to a decrease in price and therefore a decrease in inflation. The goal is to break the inflationary cycle, since when prices rise, workers may demand higher wages to keep up the cost of living. When workers receive higher wages, a business may increase its price to cover the higher labor, which results in an inflationary cycle. However, the effectiveness is debated among economists. The wage and price guidelines can be effective in the short run, but have negative effects in the long run. The businesses may not be able to keep up with the cost during inflation, cutting production and increasing unemployment. Along with this, the United States is a mixed economy where some businesses decide not to comply with the government guidelines or find other ways to compensate employees, affecting the effectiveness of the wage and price guidelines. So overall, the policy depends on a variety of factors that must align in order for the guidelines to be successful. The government can also let the economy self-correct, but that takes an extensive amount of time. So here is my final recommendation. By increasing taxes and reducing government spending, the United States can effectively address the inflationary gap by decreasing consumption and investment. Additionally, implementing contractionary monetary policies such as increasing the RRR, the discount rate, and selling government bonds can further contribute to a decrease in aggregate demand and reduce credit available in the market and increase interest rates. Wage and price guidelines could be reviewed, however, they might not be as effective. We know that these policies will prove effective, since in other instances of United States inflationary gaps, these policies worked. For example, in World War II, during the Volcker disinflation period in the early 1980s, inflation rates were 13.5%. In response, the Federal Reserve, under the leadership of Paul Volcker, implemented a series of monetary policies aimed at reducing inflation, including increasing federal fund rates from 9% to 10%, then a few years later turning that 10% to 22%, the highest ever. This in turn increased the interest rates and tightened credit availability. These policies were successful in reducing inflation. By 1983, the annual inflation rate had fallen to 3.2%. While the proposed policies are designed to address the inflationary gap, they may also have some limitations and obstacles. For example, increasing taxes can have a negative impact on consumer spending, business investment, and overall economic growth. Additionally, reducing government spending may lead to job losses and decreased demand in certain sectors, which could have a negative consequence for long-term growth prospects. Furthermore, implementing contractionary monetary policies such as increasing RRR and discount rate may lead to unintended consequences such as exacerbating credit crunches and negatively impacting economic growth. Additionally, these policies may have differential impact on different sectors and income groups, potentially exacerbating existing inequalities in the economy. So in conclusion, the United States should adopt a combination of fiscal and monetary policies to close the inflationary gap and stabilize prices. Thank you.